Hi, and welcome to our final week of East Asian religions. This is Professor Stein, and thanks for joining. This week we looked at three readings that all look at different aspects of East Asian religion circulating outside of East Asia, whether it is among people of East Asian origin or people who are not of East Asian origin. And this first reading, we're looking at a chapter from Jeff Wilson's book Dixie Dharma. This is chapter 4 called "There's No Such Thing as Not My Buddhism." Is looking at a site in Virginia that was actually started by a Japanese American Buddhist and had been at one point attended by a lot of Vietnamese American Buddhists, but now is predominantly white with some Chinese Americans, and it's kind of an unusual site for couple of reasons. So let's just dive in, and we'll pull this up. But the main question we're looking at here has to do with a thing called hybridity, which we've talked about a bit in East Asia, but it takes on a new form as East Asian religions move in transnational circulation. Okay, so we're looking at in this chapter at a particular temple that started off as a Jodo Shinshu temple, or the True Pure Land sect, which we studied. You might remember Shinran and the faith in Amida Buddha to be reborn in the Pure Land. And so this started as a Jodo Shinshu temple in 1986, but afterwards became a multi-denominational temple hosting Vietnamese Buddhists, Zen Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists, Chinese Buddhists, Vipassana, a form of meditation from South and Southeast Asia that we haven't talked about in this class, and also meditative inquiry, a new form of meditation based on Zen that was developed in the US. And Wilson says that this site is unusual even in the US for the diversity of how many lineages of Buddhism are all practicing in this same space. And in his introduction, he writes that pluralistic attitudes towards Buddhism, the acceptance of multiple different forms or lineages as legitimate, can be found in many parts of the United States. But he says it's no accident that this unusually institutionalized example of Buddhist pluralism emerged in the American South, where practitioners are relatively isolated from the American Buddhist strongholds in the North and the West and must work together in order to maintain a presence on the landscape. So what he's saying there is there's not many Buddhists in the South, and so because they are a small minority, there's kind of this sense of banding together uh, among different Buddhist lineages to kind of have a survival strategy, right, of kind of strength in numbers. And we'll see this coming out more, but he's tying um, that grouping together of multiple lineages with this idea of pluralism and hybridity, which is what we're going to focus on in the next 10 minutes or so. So, what Wilson is saying is that a result of all these different Buddhists from different lineages sharing their space is it creates a hybrid Buddhist identity that's different from other forms of hybridity that we've seen in East Asia. We have talked in this class, right, from the very beginning, about how East Asian religion tends to have hybrid elements, right, where they combine things from different traditions. We've seen that a lot of practitioners, or most practitioners, do not exclusively belong to one tradition or another, but combine practices from different traditions. And we saw this last week when we looked at, or 2 weeks ago, when we looked at surveys of contemporary East Asia, right? Most people in East Asia say they either do not belong to any religion or that they believe in or practice folk religion. But the actual denominations, especially things like Taoism and in some places Buddhism, Shinto, shamanism, right? These are not things that people identify with as their identity, right? But at the same time, anybody can practice them regardless of whether you're a quote unquote member or not. Another form of hybridity we've seen, particularly last week in contemporary East Asia, is that religion and non-religion, right? What might be called secular culture, aspects of popular culture, aspects of kind of tradition, um, are not always well differentiated. And so again, people might not see themselves as religious, but they might be practicing religious, rituals or hold beliefs that you might consider to be religious. So these are kind of popular forms of hybridity in East Asian religion. But what we're seeing here is a bit different because it's that people identify as Buddhists, but they're not taking things exclusively from one particular Buddhist sect or one particular Buddhist tradition, national tradition, or sect, but that they are freely combining elements from different forms of Buddhism. And why is it that this site has such strong characteristic of what uh, Wilson calls the hybrid Buddhist identity? Let's take a look. So from the outside, this is Ekoji Buddhist Sangha, which literally means the gift of light, temple of the gift of light, that was founded, as I mentioned, by a Jodo Shinshu group, but then quickly grew to accept a number of other Buddhist traditions here. And this is looking out at the door, um, and you see on the right is a statue of Guan Yin that was brought in by the Zen group. And then this is a separate room where the Tibetan group practices, and they're the only group to have their own room. All the other groups practice in this main hall. So this is one factor, right, for this hybridity thing. If you see on the right, this is the Pure Land group, or the Jodo Shinshu group, but they're chanting their sutra while sitting on Zen-style meditation cushions, the Zafu and Zabuton. They also sometimes use the Tibetan group's sutra benches out here. That there are two altars, one with Amida, right, that we see in the front of the room here, the Buddha of infinite light and life, Amitabha Buddha, from the Pure Land group, and also that other altar we saw before with Guan Yin from the Zen group. During sutra recitations, all the different groups that meet here use the wooden fish from the Zen group and bells that come from a Pure Land group and also a Chinese group. And on the walls, you see teachers from the Pure Land, Zen, and Tibetan traditions. So this is part of this kind of hybrid space. We also see in this community the groups coming together, right? All these different groups that practice at this same temple come together for special events like celebrating Buddha's birthday in April and the Buddha's enlightenment in December. And Wilson notes that this is not part of Tibetan tradition at all, and Vipassana groups usually celebrate the Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and death all on Vesak, which we have read about a few weeks ago in relation to Sri Lanka. And this all happens on the lunar calendar. And you might remember this was a big deal about when to celebrate. So the fact that all these groups are doing it according to the Japanese dates in April is kind of an interesting thing here. And that when these groups come together, this is an opportunity to exchange practices and beliefs. You see the photo here is at a celebration of Buddha's enlightenment, where members of the Zen, Tibetan, and Vipassana groups are all being lectured about Pure Land Buddhism. So there's these opportunities to learn from each other. And there's also people who he calls boundary crossers, who primarily attend one group, but sometimes attend another. And he talks about these boundary crossers as cross pollinators, right? They're planting the seeds from one tradition in the soil of the other tradition, so that there becomes this kind of hybridization, this mixing of ideas and practices. And some examples he gives are a Tibetan practitioner who added Japanese Zen, Zazen meditation, and also Japanese chants to her Tibetan Buddhist practice. Also, Vipassana practitioners, right, who normally are sitting this South or Southeast Asian style Theravadan Buddhist meditation, doing Mahayana practices like chanting the name of Amida Buddha from Japan, or Om Mani Padme Hum, a Tibetan chant. So, why is it that there is so much hybridity at this site? Wilson has 7 key characteristics that he thinks are important. I'm just going to go over these kind of quickly. So there's no residential leaders, meaning that the groups can kind of change at will and lay leaders have a lot of power. Also, they frequently invite outside teachers and incorporate aspects of their teachings. 2, many Americans who choose to do Buddhism do so because they see it as inherently pluralistic, right? Or being tolerant of different types of belief. And so this encourages hybridity. 3, these groups have limited resources, so they often pool their texts and ritual objects, which help lead to hybrid practices. Related, 4, the small membership of these groups allows a single person to have a great impact on the larger group. 5, the frequent contact between the groups in this space increases the opportunities for hybridization. 6, convert Buddhists have to learn about what it means to be a Buddhist as an adult rather than being socialized into the practice as a child. And the fact that they are seekers, right, often makes them predisposed to combine elements from multiple traditions. And finally, 7, none of these groups have members that have to have any particular beliefs. They don't require this for membership. And this makes members more able to hybridize their practices, to take elements from multiple sources, more than if you were a member of a religion that had a clearly defined test of, if you don't believe this, you can't be a member, or if you do believe that, you can't be a member. So these kind of lack of these belief-based formulas make it so members can combine different beliefs and different practices at will. And so Wilson calls these pluralistic Buddhists, people who incorporate elements of multiple forms of Buddhism into their practice, or even forms of other religions. We see here a picture not from the book, but just from Google Images, of a Buddha altar with a crucifix over it. And Wilson describes people doing this or having other sacred materials, maybe from indigenous or Hindu traditions, onto their home altars. He talks about people chanting or reciting to themselves Christian ideas or phrases as if they were kind of Buddhist mantras, or also practicing a kind of tantric visualization with Jesus. There's also another phenomenon he doesn't talk about here, where a lot of American Buddhists actually come from the Jewish background, so much that there's the term Jubu, which is this kind of hybrid identity as well. Wilson stresses that the groups, the Ekoji is not entirely interdenominational. Each group is still affiliated with a particular lineage, and sometimes they stress that lineage when they feel like it's becoming too hybridized. And finally, he points out that Ekoji attracts a particular kind of Buddhist. They are not people of Asian background who grew up with Buddhism. They are largely white liberals who converted in some way to a Buddhist identity in their adult years. Okay, so just to finish up, how is the Buddhist hybridity that Jeff Wilson describes at Ekoji both similar to and different from the hybridity we see in East Asian religion? And what are some of the factors that increase the kind of Buddhist pluralism that Wilson describes? I'm looking forward to hearing from you in your participation questions for the week.